this is as close as you're going to get to the equator without actually getting your feet wet. And as early as the silent movie capital was Jacksonville. During the winters, it got too cold in New York to film because you had to put lights and heat on, and both of them involved fire, and the film they were using had a nasty tendency to ignite. So when it got cold, they moved to Florida. So immediately, you've got all of this perception visually being impacted all along. I mean, Jacksonville had a great fire, like every other goods community in America. And what happened was when they rebuilt in such a hurry that they let any architectural style go on. So these silent movie people would come down, and they needed sand to do Egypt. They'd film on the shore. They had sand, sometimes more realistically than others. But they also could go to the Masonic Temple in Jacksonville, which was built in the Egyptian revival style. Throw a few palm trees to hide the lamppost, and boom, you've got your set. And even then, it's Florida being adaptable as long as you bring your money with you. And that just continues. They didn't need to film Creature of the Black Lagoon down here. I mean, they have film tanks in Hollywood, but
right.
You could use the palm trees. You could use, what's the second one? Revenge of the Creature. That uses the St. Johns River. You want to know what Jacksonville looked like in the 1930s or 40s or 50s? Find a movie. And it's just a continual perception. Disney built in Florida not because he wanted the tropics. That helps because you can leave it open year-round. But because the land was cheap. Why was the land cheap? You had swamp. So it's. I think the best way to put it is, you've got money, we're willing to give you the opportunity, you're an opportunist, you'll fit right at home. So the marketing is all geared toward, how do we get the tourist, how do we get the money from the tourist, how do we get rid of the tourist? By the way, I'm going to get a letter from the Chamber of Commerce about this.
Well, it does seem, though, that with the... I mean, just looking through the book, looking through the Horror Guide to Florida, it seems like there's no municipality down there that doesn't have some sort of connection to stories that were told, movies that were made, you know, being a location in a fictional book, or being the place where an actual sighting took place. It just seems like every town has been touched in some way. Well,
one of the great advantages to a statement like that is, you're right, because at that point they didn't have as many communities. Nowadays, I don't know how familiar you are with Pennsylvania, but Florida is kind of set up the same way. You have these townships, and then you have these villages within them that have separate governmental control. Down here, it's the same thing. I live in a town called Lake Worth, except for the fact that I don't live in Lake Worth. My zip code is also Green Acres, which is by itself a whole different story, and Wellington. I don't live in any of those towns. I live in unincorporated Palm Beach County. And as a result of that, I can say I live in any one of those three towns, but on the other hand, I don't. So a lot of the material that is filmed in a town may actually not be filmed there. It may be in the swamp next door to it that's technically not within the city borders, but how else do you describe it to somebody?
Right. There's I mean, I guess there's a lot of that, though, too, isn't there? Like, there's still... I mean, we look at things here in Massachusetts and through our New England lens where everything is kind of... It's a town, and every town has its borders, and every town has its government. But when you get to a place like Florida, a lot of things are kind of in that way. It's like you're described more by county than you are by town.
But it depends on the town also. I mean, Miami is not a city; it's the whole county. It's like Philadelphia or Boston. You know, it is technically a government that covers a county's functions, but it's also a municipality. Philadelphia particularly, they have a real aggressive ability to just grab all the communities that are near them and absorb them. And, you almost need a separate map of Philadelphia County to figure out where things were before they became part of Philadelphia. Down here, it's the opposite. Down here, Lake Worth is a community. It has its own power grid. It has its own water supply. It has its own coastline. It has its own harbor master. You walk 1 foot outside of those town borders, and it's county water, county electric, county sewage, if you even have sewage. That's a long story. And it's all maintained there. You do not see state police presence, except on the state roads. The sheriff does everything. In fact, some of the smaller communities, such as Green Acres, to use an example near me, have given up some of their independence and now pay the county sheriff to function as their police rather than be in the business of policing themselves. So that the lines blur over time as well.
I think it helps too that at least in terms of helping to keep the creepiness of Florida going, it helps that Stephen King has relocated there, and he's now started to use that as some of the centerpiece of some of his stories. Duma Key was one of the books that I remember taking place in the Keys. But he's used other Florida locations, and I think that kind of helps. I think that there's been a number of different shows. I think that show Invasion, about the alien invasion that had Eddie Cibrian, I think that took place in Florida. Yep. So you're getting a lot of these more modern stories too. So as much as you've had this long history of it, it's something that hasn't gone away either.
No, I mean Herschel Gordon Lewis, the man who invented modern-day horror movies with on-screen gore. Florida. And the reason he was down here was because they were filming Nudie Cuties, which were basically, quote-unquote, educational films about the virtues of nudism. And when that market started to dry up, I mean, how many versions of a film can you make where there's a bunch of people playing volleyball?
That movie, 1,000 of them at least. And
apparently they did.
I'll download them all.
When the meat started to dry up a little bit, he tried to figure out where to go next, and that's where you see things like Blood Feast, where he's filming at a hotel that's now underneath a Trump Tower, by the way, in North Miami. He's using North Miami's garbage trucks at the end, and he invented a type of blood that the victims could spit out, because the real stuff they were using at those days was black and white, so it was basically chocolate. Or if you had to use red, the stuff was poisoning people. So he actually invented online realistic, quote-unquote, blood to be spit out by the victims. There's the ingenuity of the Florida people for you.
Is what would you say is probably the most famous horror connection to Florida, whether it be a true story or being used in a fictional piece? What's probably what Florida's most known for?
Oh boy, I'm going to answer that with two different sites. How's that?
Sure.
One, I'm going to say Creature of the Black Lagoon, the trilogy, which is the last of the Universals, and that's a fun one because they literally filmed that everywhere. They filmed it at Marineland on the Atlantic coast up by St. Augustine. They filmed it in Crystal Springs, which is in the middle of the street. The second movie was shot at Hamasa Springs. The final movie was shot at Fort Myers in the Caloosahatchee River. It is the embodiment of Florida. We want to film in swamps and water. We shall go to Florida and film it. But my personal favorite is Key West. Key West is a tourist town, and the number one tourism down there is the supernatural. Mm-hmm. They have the doll Robert, which supposedly if you annoy it or mock it in the museum, it will then, ill fortune will befall you until you send a note apologizing to Robert. And the museum literally has a wall full of these apologies behind the doll. They filmed a lot of low-budget horror down there, of course, but H.P. Lovecraft also visited Key West. And while he was down here, that was as close as he came to the tropics. He went back to Miami. This is a beautiful segue. It has nothing to do with the question, but it's a beautiful segue. Hold me with this one.
No problem.
Goes to Miami, takes a glass-bottom boat ride into Biscayne Bay, sees the coral reefs, goes back to Providence, and then writes The Shadow over Innsmouth, which is about a coral reef off the coast. So Florida's claim to fame may also be that Lovecraft really, really liked visiting.
I mean, even to this day, people are going down there and trying to reach out to, the ghost of Hemingway is a huge thing in the paranormal world, and of course, one of the stories that I was very intrigued because, as I mentioned, you were on hold, but you couldn't hear us because you heard the Red Sox. But the new show Haunted Towns that premieres August 15th on Destination America. One of the towns that I was looking into for that was Key West, and as I'm researching that, well, not just the town, but the entire area of Key West. Not only does it have all of these great stories of people going out and trying to reach out to Hemingway and some of these other ghosts, and I can't remember the name off the top of my head, but there's the guy who had the corpse.
Count von Kozel.
Yes, having the corpse live with him for years.
The Key West necrophiliac.
And even to the modern era, to the 1970s, with the police chief Bum Fardo, who gets involved with the mafia and disappears.
Funny how that happens.
Yeah, and then just to, I love the fact that they sell T-shirts and bumper stickers that say, where is Bum Fardo?
Well, the fun thing about Key West is you get down there during the day. It's the beaches, the sunset at the fireworks. At night, it's the ghost tours. There's practically a traffic jam of ghost tours in that town. It's wonderful. Sometimes it's more fun to watch than it is to participate, but they've got one of the most beautiful little cemeteries down there. And the Count von Kozel's victim, girlfriend, I'm not sure what we call her in a case like this, but she supposedly is still buried there in one or more small plots, unmarked and now lost to time. So she tends to be very popular on the ghost tours as well.
And that was one of those stories where they're not exactly sure. For those who aren't familiar with Count von Kozel, he was Karl Tanzler was his real name, and he was a doctor. He was a bacteriologist, I think.
Oh no, he wasn't even a doctor. He was an X-ray technician. He pretended to be a doctor.
Oh, okay. So I guess he was in love with this woman when she was alive, and when she died, he took her body and had her live with him. And
yep, she was married. She had tuberculosis. When she died, the husband took off when she got sick, and he convinced the family to let him build her a tomb, and he would visit her regularly in the tomb. And at some point over the course of the years, he got a little red wagon and he brought Elena home with him. Now, there are some great pictures. Key West Library has got a online presence for graphics, and they've got pictures of Elena's tomb. If you look at it, it has a very clean lines, but it looks like the Taj Mahal, done on a very Spartan, almost brutalist level. It's got the arches, it's got the columns on either side. It's just really, really creepy. And of course, after he was let free, because there was statute of limitations on desecration of a corpse, that particular vault mysteriously blew up about the same time as he got on a train heading back home. But the plaque from that tomb is still in several pieces, but it still exists, and it's in the same Key West museum as Robert the Doll. So it's like that. If there's one building in Key West I do not want to go into at night, I think that one qualifies.
Well, what's worse is you can actually see the photos that they found of Elena Hoyos' body, because the Count actually kept her for 8 years, tied her together with piano wire and put glass eyes in when her own eyes were rotted out, and would dump perfume all over it so you wouldn't smell the decomposition. And my favorite part, he added a tube into her nether regions so that he could repeatedly over the course of 8 years have sex with her corpse.
Well, they were legally married, at least as far as he was concerned.
I mean, I guess, you can live in sin and still do that.
Your co-hosts have suddenly gotten very quiet.
Exactly.
Yes. No, you should see the look on Stephanie's face.
It's wonderful. I can only imagine what my face looks like right now. Thank you for sharing.
I mean, it wasn't so bad, except like around year 6, he was starting to yell at her like, "You always just lay there. Why don't you ever, you just lay there and don't do anything." So
that's a classic example of Florida. The story changes from person to person. There are people who claim that he had the remains of an old airplane next to his cottage or shack, and his ultimate plan was to resurrect her, and then they would fly away to heaven in his airplane. Now, the fact that the airplane had no front, no motors, and apparently that's some sort of celestial intervention involved, but it's just a weird case. There's been a lot of books about that case, and I don't think any one of them has got it right. There's just too much variation between them.
Right, and you had mentioned Robert the Doll, which I think is probably Florida's paranormal rock star, and Chris wrote about it. Chris Balzano, who's in the chat room on SpookySouthcoast.com and on YouTube. When we wrote our book Haunted Objects, he covered Robert in depth, but I dove back into that story in doing the research that I've just been doing, and that story is fascinating too, because it's another one of those cases where we don't actually know the truth behind it, and the legend has become so strong that it overtakes any shadow of the truth anyway, and it's become this great tale that people tell, but it's something that's still alive today because you still have to follow those rules if you go and see Robert the Doll, or else you could end up part of that tale.
Yeah, and that's not one story I feel a need to be a participant in.
Right. Chris actually was. He actually has had interactions with Robert, so I highly recommend anybody picks up haunted objects. Sorry, I'm so much into my own plugs that I'm confusing them.
That's so funny.
But what I always found fascinating about that story too is that with the Robert the Doll story, there's that variation as to where did the doll come from. Some say the housekeeper gave it to Jean, that it was something that was created with voodoo in mind. Other people say it was just something that was created for him in his likeness as a gift. There's all these stories, and when you have that mystery that can never actually be pinpointed, it just leads to so much more speculation.
That's one if Key West was a little bit closer. That's kind of a mantra for me. If St. Augustine was a little bit closer, if Tampa Bay was a little bit closer, that is a story I would love to pursue much deeper.
And I guess they used to bring Robert other places, but now he just spends time between 2 different museums down in Key West.
Yeah, but I suppose if you're going to be technical about what the rock star is, I'm not sure it's Robert as much as it's the Bermuda Triangle.
Right.
Which, of course, one of the points is Fort Lauderdale, if I remember.
And I just had the opportunity to go through the Bermuda Triangle a couple of months ago, and I came back alive. I made it. But not everybody has been so fortunate.
Or so you claim.
I think I'm here. Well, we did have some UFO activity while we were out there. We were out doing some UFO searching. And Moniz is showing. You can put it up to one of the cameras, Moniz, and Matt can get a shot of it. If he's able to. But Moniz has a picture of him and Robert the Doll there. And Moniz, did you pull in Elena Hoyos with Robert's body? Did you? No? Okay.
No.
All right.
No.
I'm not 100% sure Elena's tombstone, or I suppose it's a plaque, is actually on display most of the time. I got a feeling it's just way too much for the volunteers. Yep, that's our boy.
Yep. The good thing about getting back to the Bermuda Triangle, the good thing about that though is it's another one of these living stories. I guess it's not a good thing for those who are the ones that are disappearing, but they're still having issues of disappearances to this day. It's not something that is in the past. It's something that when you go through there is that chance that you might become part of the legend, because as recently as I think it was 2013, they had a disappearance there.
Yeah, and it doesn't surprise me and even if it's not a supernatural event, that is just a bad stretch of water, plain and simple. But just to play devil's advocate here, that whole area also includes an area that I've been playing in because Bermuda has a folk tradition of giant squid.
Oh,
so if you got your little boat, well, maybe it looks like lunch.
I can tell you that when we were out there, we were part of a paranormal cruise, and John Tenney was in contact with some occultists friends that were back in Detroit, and they said on this one particular night, when it's midnight in Detroit, we want you to go out onto the ship, and on whatever side it was, I forget which side it was. The left side.
Port.
Okay,
Port.
so on the port side, everybody gathered together on the port side, and at exactly midnight, these occultists were all getting together, and they were going to try and conjure up something from below the surface. And as we're all standing there, this is about an hour after we had been spotting some UFOs on a UFO watch at the bow of the ship. See the bow, I remembered. So as we were standing there and we're looking underneath the water, we start seeing these little lights that are flashing underneath the water and kind of flickering back and forth and different. It looked like something was lighting up and moving underneath the water. So there's certainly enough weird stuff out there and enough weird energy put into it that it helps some of these things, I think, have strength.
Yeah. But, I mean, this is Florida, where we have a marker for ships lost at sea and airplanes lost at sea. And, of course, the famous airplanes that are lost at sea were the Bermuda Triangle out of the Fort Lauderdale Naval Air Station.
Mm-hmm.
And they don't actually specifically have a monument to those ships, but those were men lost at sea. So technically, the monument at Fort Lauderdale Hollywood Airport is to those guys as well. And actually, that's one of the bigger losses Naval Air Station had down there. So it's just a holiday up there.
Well, and we mentioned, of course, rock stars of Florida, and one of the, I guess, rock stars would be Coral Castle. Yeah. That's something that we've covered in the past year too.
Mm-hmm. Well, my personal favorite, and it's one that is actually not as famous as it used to be, is the giant octopus of St. Augustine.
Oh, what's that one all about?
I was hoping you'd ask. 1896, something washed ashore on Anastasia Island, which is the barrier island in front of St. Augustine. 22 feet long, 6 feet high, up to 12 feet wide, pinkish gray mass, no evidence of a skeleton. The immediate assumption was that it was a giant octopus that had washed ashore. And what it was actually got lost in the fight over who got to control this giant, 7 tons of meat. And they sent pictures up to Smithsonian, who said, well, yeah, it could be a giant octopus. And they sent samples up there, and suddenly they said, oh, no, that's not a giant octopus. That's almost entirely, that's not a giant octopus. There's no tentacles, there's no structure. This is just collagen. And that was the end of it as far as the Smithsonian was concerned. But it took them almost to 2004 comparing tissue samples to figure out that it was actually the sac from the head of a sperm whale. So it's just one big empty bag that had washed on shore. But another example of a folk tale, in 100 years it took to kill it. And I'm still not 100% sure they did kill it. The cryptozoology crowd really hates to lose that one.
Well, we do have a question in the chat room, and people can put their questions in the chat room at SpookySouthCoast.com, or on the Spooky South Coast app, or on YouTube, or you can call in 508-996-0500, 877-996-1420. But getting back for a moment, Ross in the chat room wants to know what you think about Coral Castle, if you have any thoughts on Coral Castle.
Oh, I'm impressed that they found a picture of the St. Augustine octopus now.
Matt is on point. He is the best.
If he knows who took that picture, I'll give him double points.
Oh, he might find it.
Oh, I know he'll find it, but if he doesn't, the man who created the St. Augustine Historical Society, a fellow named DeWitt.
Wow.
Like I said, I've been putting a lot of time into sea serpents down here lately. As for Coral Castle, I'm not sure what to make of it. I mean, I know the tourist spiel. It was built by one man by himself, and with the unpronounceable last name that he has.
I will never forget it. Edward Leedskalnin.
Yeah, I'm Dutch. I got enough of my problems of my own name.
That's emblazoned into my mind forever from the episode that we did on it.
But I mean, for those who don't know what it is a beautiful, beautiful thing. He supposedly built it because he was spurned by his betrothed, who frankly sounded a little young for him. But that's just between you and me.
Well, it is Florida, so.
Yeah, well, yeah, even Florida's got. No, who am I kidding? We got no standards. It's something like 1,100 tons of coquina, which is basically a sedimentary rock, shaped and placed into position, apparently by himself. Carved furniture, castle tower. I don't know. I mean, the thing I usually throw out at people is it's not a coral castle. It's coquina is actually a type of limestone, but that doesn't really impress anybody anymore. But yeah, I mean, coquina carves very easily with metal tools, but in terms of getting a multi-ton slab up on its side, in the immortal words of the Marquis de Sade, beats me.
Right. I mean, it is. And that is believed to be a place that brings a lot of power and energy to it. And that could be helping to feed into all the weirdness of Florida.
Yeah.
As one possibility.
I think weirdness in Florida may be a little redundant by itself, but...
Sorry, go ahead, Moniz.
Yeah. What are your takes on the St. Augustine Lighthouse?
You know what? The first thing I always ask is, which one do you mean? Because I think half of the stories that you hear about the barbershop hole one, the current one, actually date back to the previous one, which was a shorter coquina. Again, we're back to that. Structure that was built by the Spanish, and it's actually only I don't even think it's 2 miles down the road, and it's just stone ruins at this point. But a number of the haunting stories that I've heard, it seems like they're confusing the two lighthouses. So that's kind of where I walk into it. There's a lot of ghost stories for one lighthouse, and there's a lot for two even. But to have two right next to each other like that,
I mean, it's
weird. It's weird even by St. Augustine standards.
It's certainly a go-to destination for a lot of people, though, when they want to go down there and check out some of the, some of these Florida stories. That's always on everybody's map. Mm-hmm. And I know that we were talking about how Disney has become such a piece of identity of Florida, the main piece of identity for Florida for a lot of people. And Disney has its ghost stories, too. Disney has its weirdness stories. Disney has all of these strange things that are associated with it as well. I'm even thinking about the fact that there was a book that came out a few years ago, probably about 10 years ago now, where that talked about Disney's connections to ley lines. I don't mean to hang up.
That threw me for a loop because I don't think I've heard that one before.
I'll have to see if I can. I know I got it originally as an ebook, and I might still have it saved in my files. I'll see if I can get it over to you. But that was just one of the many theories, is that's why Disney is a place of such energy, is because it's built on ley lines, and that they were trying to funnel some of that energy. But just Disney in general has weird stories associated with it.
Yeah, well, if you ever look at a map of the Magic Kingdom and the utilidors underneath, that does have some alignment to it. whether that's just construction and architecture or if it's deliberate, that's out of my field. But I will tell you my favorite story about Disney has nothing to do with Orlando. It's actually Anaheim. When they opened Pirates of the Caribbean, Walt didn't think the skeletons looked realistic enough. So he went to the University of California and got real-life skeletons and put them in the exhibit. So when you went through Pirates of the Caribbean, when you saw the skeletons, they were actually skeletons. And it was only later when the technology caught up and he could make realistic-looking skeletons that they quietly got rid of them. But there's a persistent rumor to this day that if you look in the Pirates' treasure room at the end of the ride, there's a skull in the back of it, and that actually is the last piece of the live bodies that were there. That is a real skull, supposedly.
Well, before we get off the subject of Disney, I do want to point this out. And, of course, the Muppets are now owned by Disney. And the story broke this week that Steve Whitmire had been fired as the voice of Kermit the Frog. So I'm just going to ask you, Dave, because you're in Florida, and I'm going to ask Chris because he's in Florida. If anybody has some free time, want to go over to Disney to the Henson Studios and recommend me as a possible replacement for Steve Whitmire as the voice of Kermit, I'd be more than happy to be the new Kermit the Frog.
I think they already replaced him, but
it doesn't matter. He won't be as good as me.
well, that's true.
All right.
I've actually been to the Henson Studios in Hollywood.
I'm sure that must have been amazing.
Oh, it was incredible. But the most incredible part to me, and this may be a geek thing or it may be an age thing, is the Jim Henson Studios are the old Charlie Chaplin studio.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And for all the stuff we saw, I mean, we saw the original puppets from Dark Crystal. We saw them filming an episode of Sid, whatever the heck the kid show is. We saw the Muppets, and all this stuff. My highlight of that visit was a picture of me standing next to Charlie Chaplin's original film vault, which is a metal vault on the outside of the building because, of course, films were flammable. And all the film, I'm geeking out just thinking about it again.
Well,
so close to so much greatness.
I mean, and not to bring it back to the Muppets for a moment, but I've had the chance with working with different conventions and Comic-Cons. I've had the chance to kind of hear some pretty fascinating celebrities tell stories, and I've heard some pretty good inside Hollywood stuff. And I think one of my favorite speakers I've ever heard listen was Mike Quinn, who is a Muppeteer, and hearing him talk about working on the Dark Crystal, working on Star Wars and things like that. He's 9 Nub, and so to hear all of these stories about working closely with Jim Henson was fascinating to me, and there was definitely a magic around that, and I'm sure that magic, already tapping into the Charlie Chaplin magic, kind of only amplified it even more.
It's an unbelievable place. You can feel the creativity oozing out of the buildings as you walk in. And really was a highlight of the trip to me.
Before we leave Florida and we come north back to New England and bring you back home, I do want to ask you about Cassadaga because, again, spiritualism is something that I've been talking about quite a bit lately. I just lectured on it again last weekend at Ocean State Paracon, and Cassadaga is just one of those places. It's like Lilydale South, and it's a fascinating story. So what's the deal with Cassadaga?
Well, funny you call it Lilydale South because technically Cassadaga was supposed to be Cassadaga South.
Mm-hmm.
As you know, it's named after a upstate New York trance medium operation. It was actually, I think it was, he left Cassadaga, New York, under orders from his spirit guide, came down here, and it's really not that good of a neighborhood, if you know what I mean. It's just swamp all the way around. It is a small town that is mostly psychics and mediums, and one of the creepiest cemeteries ever is the Lake Helen Cemetery, which is right next door to it. and it has one of those. And I think I can't remember who brought it up originally. It might have been on your website looking around. It has a devil's chair in it.
Mm-hmm.
And the story there is if you sit in the chair, nothing bad will happen, but you need to leave an unopened beer behind the chair, because after you leave, the devil's going to come up and see what the heck's been going on, and if he doesn't have his refreshment, somebody's going to pay for it. How can you go wrong with a town like that, especially when you put it in Florida?
Well, I mean, and all of these places, I think, help with, the fact that this is a go-to destination for people who are tapping into a certain kind of energy. It helps with raising that level of energy. Stephanie, you probably can speak to this better than I can, but having a group of people who are supposedly operating on a higher vibrational level is only going to kind of raise the vibrational level up around it, I would assume.
No, it definitely does. And you can definitely feel the difference of walking into a room full of those type of people and just walking into, let's say, the grocery store.
Mm-hmm.
How about walking into a cemetery full of those people?
That would be pretty interesting, I think.
That's Lake Helen Cemetery, where all the Casadegans are buried.
Interesting.
I apologize, Matt, for messing up your camera shot of me, but I can't sit in that chair. You got to stand up for a minute. This chair's killing me.
Yeah, mine's not feeling too good either. But
but I did lie, Dave, when I said we're gonna leave Florida with that, because I do want to ask you: is Gibtown still a thing down in Florida? The retired circus community?
Not as much as it used to be. I mean, in a statement I don't believe I would have ever said out loud if they would ask me, I believe most of the freaks have died off.
Not in our audience.
Well, I was thinking professionals, but okay. There are some minor things there. To be honest, it's more interesting to go up to the cemetery where people like Lobster Boy are buried. And but Gibtown is there. It's unfortunate that it wasn't preserved, but I suppose even the most liberal of chambers of commerce are going to get a little cranky about pet zebras and pet lions wandering around.
Well, I mean, I just ask only because, the Barnum and Bailey Circus, Ringling Brothers, is over now. So I'm sure that a lot of those folks are going to retire, and they'd be probably looking to go to a place like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think Gibtown probably had its last hurrah, and I may be wrong about this, when Scully and Mulder visited back in season 2.
Oh, I forgot all about that. Yeah,
going way back. American Horror Story really missed an opportunity when they could have put the season with the freak show over there, but for some reason they chose to put it on the Atlantic coast.
Yeah, I mean, I think it
actually would have been down by me in Jupiter.
I think it was supposed to be, it was supposed to be like an allegory to that.
Yeah, I mean, there's no question. But Gibtown was basically the winter home for the circus sideshow, and I do not know if they ever changed the zoning laws, but they were allowed to keep circus animals and circus trailers, and I'm not sure there's enough of them left that it's a community the way it used to be. So there is supposedly traces of it if you know what to look for, where the giant I think it was actually called the Giant Diner. The world's tallest man had a restaurant. He actually had one of his old shoes out front, size 100 billion, triple X wide type thing. And I have heard rumors. I have not been able to find it. I have not confirmed it. But I have heard rumors that a piece of that show is still adhered to the wall or the brick fence that near where the building was. So it's more like traces. There should have been more work done to preserve it, but who knew the circus would ever die?
Well, why don't we kind of use that circus connection to to kind of bring it back to New England a little bit. There was Mrs. Tom Thumb from Middleborough, Massachusetts.
Mm-hmm.
So General Tom Thumb, who was part of the circus for many years, his wife is a Bumpus from Middleborough, coming back up to New England.
That was a beautiful segue,
Thank
by the
you.
way.
It's also, I think, the first time anybody's ever used Mrs. Tom Thumb as a segue, and probably be the last. But
well, that's really between her and Mr. Tom Thumb.
Do you find, and of course you have 2 books from this series with both Northern New England and Massachusetts, do you find that this area is just more flush with horror connections and strange stories than Florida, or do you see it as kind of being, it wasn't so hard to find them in either place?
I think the difference, particularly with Massachusetts compared to Florida, is that New England venerates the old. Florida tends to bulldoze it and put up a Trump Tower.
Right.
So as a result, the old buildings remain, so do the old stories. Now, Mrs. Tom Thumb, to fall back on your segue, was a Bumpus, as you said.
Yes.
Bumpus is a very, very, very old name in Massachusetts. In fact, it was the second boat. Mayflower was first. Bumpuses came over on the second boat. That's how far back it goes. It has absolutely nothing to do with Mrs. Tom. I really don't like calling her Mrs. Thumb. But it's an example of what you're talking about. She could, if she chose to, or if I chose to, for that matter, we could trace her all the way back to the Plymouth colony and the 1640s. And then because of her affiliation with Plymouth, we could take her back to England. You don't see that in Florida. In Florida, you have St. Augustine, the oldest continually inhabited place. But none of the buildings date back that far. There were older buildings in New England because the English burned St. Augustine to the ground in the 1710s. So, yes, it's the oldest continually inhabited, but the buildings only date back, you can tell I'm a New Englander, they only date back to the 1700s. Plymouth Rock, 1640. How many stories are attached to that alone? Plymouth Colony, possible cannibalism, the first bad winter. It stays, the stories stay when the property stays, when the buildings stay. Are there ghosts in Florida? Yeah, but where's the ghost going to go when you tear down the building it haunts? Right,
and unfortunately, a lot of the times they just stay on the property and they stay into the new dwelling, which is what we see a lot of here in New England. We have people say, well, my house is only, 40 years old. How could it be haunted?
Yeah, but what was there first? And that's where it comes down. Florida, the best, I'm trying to think of a good example, and there really aren't any. The old houses were shacks along the rivers or the shacks along the ocean. And there's nothing there now. Those shacks are, Lake Worth, go back to the old hometown here, that was a series of fishing shacks along Lake Worth back when it was still fresh water. Then they opened up the outlet and made it brackish, but there's nothing there to haunt because it's now beach. And the buildings have been set back because of environmental concerns. So what's a spirit to do?
There does seem to be, with New England stories, with New England legends, and it doesn't have to be just ghosts. It can happen. We have our own sea creature stories. We have our own cryptid stories. All of these stories that we have, there is a very much a protective nature around these stories that even if people don't believe them, even if people want to consider them all to just be storytelling and hogwash, we also don't want anybody else bastardizing them either. They have become part of our fabric. And this goes all the way back to the time of the Pilgrims when we had stories that were coming even from that era that they were very protective of. So it's kind of ingrained in us as New Englanders to protect our legends.
Yes. And we've got certainly enough of them. French and Indian War, from my neck of the woods up in Haverhill, let's not forget our Hannah Dustin.
What's that story?
But Salem witch trials. the Salem witch executions were not the first witch executions in New England,
Mm-hmm.
but they're the ones that have become, to phrase it indelicately, marketable. Connecticut had a number of hangings that predate Salem by decades. They were embarrassed by them. They've gone away. They're starting to get a little more press nowadays, but when you say witches New England, you immediately go to Salem. You don't think Connecticut.
Right. And one of the things too that's amazing about the Salem stories is that people don't understand all of the background behind it. They don't understand the history behind it. They don't understand the just the way that things were in Salem at that time, with the politics of the area, with the class warfare that was going on there. You know, there's a lot of aspects of that story that are just lost in the basic telling of, you know, there was this housekeeper that, you know, put these girls into a spell, and next thing you know, everybody's getting hanged for being witches.
Yeah, and the kicker to this whole thing is Salem isn't where it all took place. It took place in Danvers.
Right. Well, it was Salem Village at the time, but
the court case and everything were in Salem proper, but you know, Giles Corey was actually pressed to death out in Danvers, which is still a rough way to go. But people forget that wasn't a standalone. There was the Connecticut cases beforehand. Then there's the second spike of the witch trial, which took place in Andover, which in those days was everything north of Salem all the way up to the Merrimack River. So North Salem, North Andover, and everything. In Andover, somebody's wife got sick, and this rocket scientist came up with the idea, well, perhaps she's bewitched. Let's bring a couple of the accused witches from Salem up here and see what they think.
Right.
What could possibly go wrong?
And then a lot of it was based on, you know, courtroom theatrics, where, you know, if you bring those girls into the room, well, of course the person who's accusing them of witchcraft is going to have an adverse reaction to them, because otherwise everybody's going to know you're making up this story. Yeah.
But I think part of it also up in New England is interconnectivity. The Salem witch trials, everybody knows who Nathaniel Parris's witch. But up in the north, in the Andover spike, it's a little less known. Timothy Swan accused a number of women of being witches, most of whom had turned him down, but that's a coincidence, I'm sure. And Timothy Swan had previously been the father of an illegitimate child of Hannah Duston's sister. Hannah Duston's sister, the children died. She was accused of killing them, which it's a very long, and you don't want to get into it now. It's not actually it's not a hanging offense to kill your children. It's a hanging offense to hide the fact that they died. So she was hanged in Boston Common by Cotton Mather. Cotton Mather, of course, is the person who then interviews Hannah Duston about her exploits with the Indians, and round and round and round we go.
Right.
You don't. That's something you don't see in Florida, and part of it is because nobody's admitting anything. But in New England, we embrace it. Yes, this woman was captured by Indians. Yes, she killed 12 Indians who probably had nothing to do with her kidnap. But let's put a statue up anyway. And then let's believe that a woman who's never ridden in a canoe, along with her elderly midwife and a teenager from Worcester, then get into a canoe at night in the winter and manage to go from Concord, New Hampshire, back down to Haverhill in the frozen water with the ice and, of course, the waterfalls that nobody seems to mention at all. Yeah, let's embrace it and not look at the holes in that theory. Pet peeve, by the way.
No, understandable. There's a lot of, I don't want to say whitewashing to some of the New England stories, because that's kind of where they came from originally, was from the colonists, from the settlers. But there definitely seems to be a lens to a lot of these early stories. We're looking at the world through Puritan eyes for a couple of hundred years. And even now, even to this point, when we do what we do up here, going to all these ghost places, we still have to deal with a lot of the still, bubbling below the surface Puritan idealism that still exists around here. And that it's kind of demonized a lot of what could be just regular strange activity that has suddenly turned into, evil and negative and the work of the devil, when in actuality, if we had just been kind of pursuing this stuff to begin with, we might have a better idea of the bigger picture of what's going on.
Mm-hmm. So it's more interesting to work in New England than it is in Florida. And as it turns out, it's more interesting than working in Pennsylvania, because unless you're a big fan of Romero and Shyamalan, there ain't a heck of a lot else going on in that state.
Right. And, rest in peace, George Romero.
Mm-hmm.
We should put that out there. We lost him this week.
Yep.
And I was pleasantly surprised that nobody made any jokes about him coming back from the dead. So.
Oh, I did.
You did?
Through my Facebook history.
Okay. Well, if anybody had to do it, Dave, I'm not surprised it was you.
I was actually accused by my brother of too soon.
Well, yeah, I think that probably might have been, but when you're dealing with zombies, how long is too soon? You don't want to wait too long, right?
Exactly.
You got to kind of get it going there. So
we're not going to go into the whole zombies versus ghoul thing, please. We only have a finite amount of time here.
But there are zombie stories that pop up as well. I mean, there's even going back to the colonial era. I'm not sure how familiar you are with them, but even going back to the colonial era around here, there's still stories of the undead coming back to life. Those who were thought to have perished, in the harsh winters, still seen in the springtime, coming back, walking in from the woods. There's.
Oh yeah, that's practically a mythic archetype up here.
And it's certainly something that isn't going to go away anytime soon, with all this attention being paid to zombies.
Mm-hmm. Well, zombies were kind of passé for a while, and apparently they're back.
Yeah, I mean, that's a lot of these types of stories are cyclical in nature. There are time periods where some stories are told more than others. What's kind of your favorite? And when we're dealing with New England, and this could be either for the horror guide to Massachusetts or the horror guide to northern New England, but when you're dealing with stories up in this area, like, what's kind of your favorite? Do you have like a favorite era, a favorite concentration of stories, a favorite area? What is it that kind of stands out to you, that if somebody said to you down in Florida, "Hey Dave, you're from New England, tell me one really weird story up there that would be something that I wouldn't normally hear about"?
Oh God, I love getting caught by surprise. That is not something I was expecting.
Well, I'm not going to ask the usual questions
here. All right, I got it. It just takes me a minute sometimes to think out loud. In the Crawford Notch, up in the White Mountains, there is a story that Nathaniel Hawthorne used to tell. In fact, he made it into a story. And I'm completely blanking on what the name of the story was. The Ambitious Guest. It's coming back to me. It has nothing to do with the fact that I have a PDF of the book in front of me. It's a short story he wrote. It was based on an actual story up there. And it was a family who... The real story, he made it into one of his classic little pieces, but the real story is there was a family who set up a cabin at the foot of the mountain, and the mountain was prone to avalanches at this point. And what happens is they know there's a problem. They listen for rock slides all the time, and this is a real case that happened. It's called the Wiley tragedy, back in like 1826, 1827, somewhere in there. So what this family does is they are so plagued by these rock slides, and they're so afraid of them, that they actually build a shelter made out of stone near the house, so that if there is a rock slide, they can run out, go into this shelter, and be protected from it. Well, they hear the noise. They know there's a rock slide coming. They run out. They hide in their shelter, and they're killed because there was a ledge directly above the house that diverted the rock slide on either side of the house. And by skipping the house and going on either side of it with the rock slide, it hit their shelter instead. So they were killed trying to avoid a avalanche when if they had stayed in the house, they would have been fine. And that is how in the White Mountains, Mount Wiley got its name. It's still named that. It's up on the west side of the Notch.
I'm scrolling through the now. For those who are not familiar with the Horror Guide series, I mean, you have, as I mentioned, the Horror Guide to Florida, the Horror Guide to Massachusetts, the Horror Guide to Northern New England. Is this going to be something that is going to be, across the nation? Is that the plan?
Well, I don't think we'll live that long based on the output level. My brother is up to his armpits in other projects, so I'm doing Pennsylvania by myself right now, which I can do because I lived in Pennsylvania for 10 years, so I've got some familiarity with that state as well. We would like to get southern New England done next, but that's basically Lovecraft,
right?
And a lot of ghost movies in Connecticut. So we haven't been in a hurry. Lovecraft is one of my major projects down here, and I really find it very easy to get Lovecraft out when you're working on Lovecraft in Florida at the same time as you're working on a Horror Guide to Rhode Island. So we're staggering it a little bit now.
Well, what I find interesting is the way that these books are set up, and kind of explain to the listeners how you put together these guides.
Well, I used to use the term, imagine a turn-of-the-century gazetteer, but apparently nobody remembers gazetteers but me. It is a alphabetical listing of towns and villages, and in some cases a lot of specifics. When you get to a town like Boston, for instance, it's Boston, a particular street name. So it's set up alphabetically by town, and it is a series of small listings for what took place on that location. And what it allows you to do is it's sort of a combination of suggested future reading, history of horror, and where films were shot. So it almost becomes a reader's advisory as well as just a fun way to show what was filmed where within the state. And northern New England in particular has got some really funky stuff going on. Mystery Hill is the one that I use all the time. Mystery Hill, and this is one of my pet theories, is what Dunwich Horror was based on. Lovecraft had been visiting a suit. Apparently, she thought it was a romantic suitor. It turns out Lovecraft just really liked to travel, and she brought him up there, saw the sacrificial table. A few years later, he writes the Dunwich Horror with its sacrificial table, and the description of walking up to the hill matches the terrain. The story itself is probably based on Wilbraham, Massachusetts, but the sacrificial table is North Salem, New Hampshire. Of course, Uncle Stevie lives up in Maine. Everybody knows that one.
Right.
But
he's more down your neck of the woods these days, most of the time anyway.
Well, he owns the whole damn island at this point. He has a huge estate on Casey Key. Probably 6 or 7 bedrooms. It's got its own pool. And he didn't like one of the neighbors, so he bought him out. And that's his guest house. So he's got like 3 of these houses in a row now. So he's got, 15, 16, 17 bedrooms between the 2 houses, 3 pools. Horror has been very good to Uncle Stevie.
Well, and I think that that's part of the mentality of people in New England is for some reason there's something about our collective psyche up here that plays into that allows hard to kind of flourish. That's why you have people like, I know that Poe was, around the place, but Poe and Lovecraft and now Stephen King, they have a lot of New England roots in what it is that they do.
Yeah, and their predecessors as well. Sarah Orne Jewett, probably the first person to write a collection of stories, some of which are supernatural, some of which are not. But the concept of a unified world based on a community, that's her idea, Dunnett's Landing. That was before Arkham, that was before Castle Rock. She's the one who came up with that concept. It's a dying little fishing village on the coast of Maine, and that's where all her stories are set. That was a brand new concept when she came up with it.
There's horror stories that go back and just scary stories that people would tell going all the way back to, as I mentioned, the Pilgrims. And I've talked to our friend Jeff Campbell about this. He runs the Plymouth Night Tours, and they have a lot of different stories that they tell there. And there's a lot of different haunted places in Plymouth that people can visit. But you can just feel it when you go to a place like that. When you go to Plymouth, when you go to Salem, you can feel that in the air, and you can kind of feel that in the environment of this strangeness that goes on. Stephanie, you probably pick up on it anyway, based on things. But for even like the normal person, not that you're not normal, but even for people that don't have your ability to tap into things.
Careful there, you're in trouble already.
Right?
I'll just keep digging.
Yeah.
And but even just folks like us that don't have those sensitivities can experience it when we go there. We say, wait a minute, there's something about this place when I go there that just feels odd.
Right.
Well, Mystery Hill up in North Salem, which I have some minor familiarity with. I ran it for a couple of years. Is the closest I've got to an encounter, because we were up there on Halloween, which we were up there because we had to keep people off the site. You talk about insurance being an issue. People wandering around the woods at night is not a good thing for your insurance.
Right.
So locals would tend to want to go up there to, quote-unquote, see the witches. So we would go up there, and we would discourage people from going up there, and we would chase people off. Because the other thing that just concerned us is if somebody has a ceremony up there, and that wax drips into a sensitive test zone, it completely screws up the carbon-14 datings. I mean, Mystery Hill, for all its quaintness and all its odd history, is still a functioning, working archaeological site. And the last thing you need is a 2000 BC carbon date that's messed up by somebody dropping candle wax on it. But we went up there, and we were not staying up at the top of the hill. We were using the viewing platform to keep an eye on things. But it's Halloween in New Hampshire. It tends to get a little nippy. So we were going up the trail, and over the tree line, suddenly coming down past us silently, 3 balls of white light. Just kept going, and that was it. Unfortunately, the guy I was on patrol with had his weapon out already and was spooked to death. I went up by myself after that. He calls them ghost lights. I'm inclined to think they were earthquake lights, but I think that's just frame of reference more than anything else. I'm a big fan of tectonic stress syndrome as an explanation for some of the more questionable UFO sightings out there. And Mystery Hill is a classic example of a place that can issue earthquake lights. It's a piezoelectric discharge, so Larry can have his job. And that would be similar to what we saw, but to this day, I still have no idea what we actually saw up there.
One of my favorite stories, and you mentioned it in, you have it in the Horror Guide to Massachusetts, is, I don't know if you recall it off the top of your head, but Joseph Jeffries in the town of Sandwich. Do you remember that?
Yes.
Just because
Van Winkle.
I have a personal connection of why I like this story. But if you can share that with the listeners.
Oh, I'm gonna cheat and pull that one up out of the book.
You absolutely can. There's nothing wrong with that.
To tell you the truth, the Northern New England is the most recent one. Massachusetts was the earliest.
Right.
So I'm really a little out of sorts on some of this material. And I don't like to admit I don't read my own books regularly, but I don't read my own books regularly.
No, I feel the same way. Believe me.
Yeah. Oh, I actually own one of yours.
Well, hold on to it because I saw one of them was selling for like $50 on Amazon. So.
Wow.
Yeah.
I'll have to get it signed that way.
Oh, that'll devalue it big time.
Yeah. Welcome to my world. Joseph Jefferson was a stage actor. He died in 1905. Just to give you an idea how far back we're talking. And his signature role was Rip Van Winkle. And it's based on the Washington Irving story. It practically could have, I think he may have been able to perform it for Washington Irving. He'd been so long. But he made so much money, he actually bought a house. He called it the Crow's Nest. It was sitting on, overlooking the Cohasset Narrows Bridge near what is now called Electric Avenue.
Yep. We're going to rock on down to there after the show.
Yes, you can. But it was really a weird situation because when it was being built, they uncovered a skeleton. And this is not some local rag. This is the New York Times who reported it. It was an oversized skull with no eye sockets, but a hole in the forehead. So Jefferson believed he had discovered the skeleton of a cyclops. The problem is that building and the skull were destroyed in a fire in 1893. So we'll never know for certain. But if you want to see what that section of Buzzard Bay looked like in the 1890s, you can still find pieces of the film Rip Van Winkle they shot in 1903, and they shot it in the riprap along the shoreliner.
And I think what I love about the Jefferson story is that even though he did live in Buzzards Bay, he wanted to move to Sandwich.
Yes, he did.
And they didn't take too kindly with an actor wanting to come to town.
Oh, scum of the earth. An actor person?
Especially back then, because we're talking about, back then, before films had really become part of the culture, people really looked down on actors.
Oh, yeah. I mean, this is a traveling actor. That's one step above pond scum. Despite the fact he had one of the biggest houses in the area, and despite the fact that his next-door neighbor and BFF was Grover Cleveland,
right?
He wanted to build his house in Sandwich. They wouldn't let him, so he built it where he did, and then he just got himself buried at Bayview Cemetery to spite them. So if you go up to Bayview Cemetery, there's a big boulder there that he handpicked to mark his gravesite, and it's there specifically just to spite the neighbors.
And from somebody that lives in Sandwich and wasn't too welcomed by the Sandwich people, I can sympathize with Joseph Jefferson. So that's
it seems to be a thing with Sandwich.
It still is. I was in like 6th grade at the time, but still, I was not exactly treated well by the younger citizens of the town. So I understand exactly what he went through. And I don't know if I'll go through the process of being buried there with a giant boulder, but at least
it does seem a little extra work. But
I am proud of him for sticking it to them just a little bit.
Good for all of us.
And again, so I know that we've been talking about the different stories around here, and that you said that you are working on the Pennsylvania book. Is there anything that you can give us as kind of a little teaser for Pennsylvania?
Boy, there is so much stuff. Pennsylvania seems to be the place where people go to die. I've got more cemetery listings already. We're only about 40,000 K into this, so we're barely at the halfway mark. and I swear most of it is burials and cemeteries.
There's a lot of UFO stuff, though, too, right? There's a lot of UFO stuff in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, I haven't gotten to any of it yet. We're basically
And
we
Bigfoot.
I probably shouldn't admit this on this show, but we try to keep the paranormal and away from the horror because really,
Sure,
that's not my field. You want to talk about the history of Hershey chocolate and why H.P. Lovecraft loved it. You want to talk about where Night of the Living Dead was filmed. That's horror history. I can deal with that. But in terms of the supernatural, it's not my strength. There are people like your crew who are far more qualified to discuss it.
well, but you also
I don't want to put too much in my books because I'll just embarrass myself if I go into depth far enough.
we also haven't jumped into one of our main areas of expertise tonight, one of the Spooky Crew's main area of expertise, but you just alluded to it when you mentioned Hershey's chocolate, and that, of course, is being snacks. That's something that we talk about quite a bit, but what is you just got to give us a little teaser of the connection with Lovecraft and Hershey's chocolate.
Lovecraft had a sweet tooth, plain and simple. Lovecraft, probably half of the reason why he died so young was because he was so malnourished most of the time. He didn't know he had a cancer. That's how bad his diet. He took great pride in being able to eat on 14 cents a day.
Wow.
Now, I actually went out and did the math on this. It's as bad as it sounds even today. A 14 cents meal for him, and he only ate once a day or twice if he was really feeling lucky, was half a can of chili, a block of cheese, and a donut. That was basically a day's food for him.
That actually doesn't sound that bad.
Yeah, for one meal. But what would happen is he would cut back even harder when he was traveling because he was so tight on the money. And he would keep snacks in his room because that way he could eat that, buy it in bulk at the local supermarket, and not spend money on things like real food. And one of his favorite snacks was Hershey's chocolate. It kept well, except when he got to Florida, where he kind of stopped doing that. But he would keep a can of nuts and some chocolate in his room, sometimes a little cheese, and some days that's all he was eating. So Hershey's chocolate was his favorite. He says so repeatedly in letters to people. In fact, his aunts, rather than send him presents, clothes that he needed or cash that he needed, he wouldn't take it, but he would take the chocolate when they mailed it.
Well, I can tell you now that the paranormal runs on Swedish Fish up here now.
Well, one of the great shortcomings to living in Florida, one of the many shortcomings to living in Florida is I can't get fluff.
Well, we'll have to mail you down some. There's a world without fluff is a world not worth living in.
A 5-pound bucket of the stuff on eBay or Amazon. It was tempting.
That's like my love of that Jeff Belanger got me into. My love of Skyline chili. That I can't get around here. So I had to work out a deal with Greg Newkirk to send him Necco wafers in exchange for Skyline chili.
I don't know of anybody who goes out of their way for Necco wafers, but okay.
Yeah, apparently he loves Old Man Candy, and that there's no more Old Man Candy than Necco wafers.
I'm going to tell you a story I have never told anyone.
Oh.
In my wild, impetuous youth, I square danced. And the reason I tell you that horrible secret is because I danced at Northern Essex Community College, which is called up there Necco.
Ah.
So what do you give out to the guests when they come? Necco wafers.
And what do they do with them? Throw them right back at you?
I don't remember everybody ever eating any, but...
So I just want to let you know that this just popped up in the chat room. Chris Balzano says he can get fluff on his coast down in Florida.
Well, again, he's let me think. He's Fort Myers.
So, well, listen, I don't know how long of the drive is from where you are to where he is, but it's got to be worth it to get some fluff from the guy.
Well, it would. Let's see. I'd have to go down to Fort Lauderdale, get on Alligator Alley, cross the Everglades, and come out near Estero, which I'm going to mention Estero again in a second now that I'm thinking of it, and then up to Fort. Yeah, it's about 3.5 hours.
Totally worth it.
But Estero is you talk about a Florida place. Was another cult like the Casadegas mediums, and they were. I mean, they aren't anymore, but at that point it was a medium cult. Estero was a group from up north who came down here and built a utopian society. Their belief was that the world was hollow and we lived on the inside. And it was a celibate cult, except for of course, except for the master of the whole thing. And when he died, he said, "Don't bury me. I'll be back in a few days." So they put him in a nice bathtub with some ice, and he didn't come back, and he didn't come back, and he didn't come back, and things started getting a little unpleasant. So they put him in a crypt, but the crypt actually had a door he could open when he did come back. And they waited 5 or 6 years, and he never came back, and the entire operation folded eventually, and his crypt was swept out to sea. It's not the most auspicious end to a cult, but it's all we got. The old buildings from the Estero cult are now a state park. It's a swimming and hiking thing, but it's also got an interpretive area with these old buildings. It amuses me.
Oh, absolutely. Well, why don't you let everybody know how they can get these books, The Horror Guide to Florida, The Horror Guide to Massachusetts, The Horror Guide to Northern New England, plus all of your other work.
All of my other work as well. Everything I have, everything I ever wanted to be, everything that I plan to write will always be available on Amazon. You can go to my website if you want, which is my last name, goudsword.com, and you'll see my website and you'll see my brother's website. Just click on my smiling face and you'll go to my private little site, which basically lists every book I ever wrote and a few that I won't even admit to. And they're all there.
And it's absolutely worth going and checking out all of his work, and check out some of his past visits with us here on Spooky Southcoast. Dave, we thank you so much for joining us. Hopefully you'll let us know when the Pennsylvania book is done. I will do that, and thank you for having me. All right, you have a great night, and say hi to Scott for us as well. I will do that. Thank you. All right, take care. That is Dave Goudsward, and again, you can check out his website, goudsward.com, GOUDSWARD.com. And we'll have it linked up on SpookySouthcoast.com as well for you. And it's absolutely worth going there and checking out and seeing all of the different work that they've done. Again, the horror guides, H.P. Lovecraft and the Great Altar Stones of New England. And that's one of the early things that one of the very early things we talked with Dave about on the show is ancient stone sites of New England and America's Stonehenge, things like that. Definitely worth going back and checking out those episodes as well, which you can get all of our episodes free on iTunes or wherever you find podcasts. Also on YouTube, we have all the video archives. Pretty much everywhere you can find podcasts, you can find us. And I've noticed that over the years, podcasts have become very protective of their archives. You can only get like the most recent 10 episodes, and then you have to pay subscriptions for the rest of them. Yeah, eventually we might figure all that stuff out. But for right now, everything is free. So download them all now. Go back and get every episode that we've ever done. There's over 500 of them, so if you've missed any, you've got some listening to do. Next week, we'll be back with Ben Jeffries. We'll be talking about the Boogeyman next week, which I'm pretty excited about. Creepy. I'm not going to blow my nose for an entire week, so that when we come in next week, I will have plenty of boogies. Oh, my goodness. No, that's gross. Perfect. But we will be back next Saturday night. So until then, for Matt, for Chris, for Stephanie, I'm Tim, and we want you all to stay spooktacular.